My name is Dave Carey. I have some important information and a disturbing new analysis to share with you on the real state of our schools. Please make the time to watch this video and to share it with others. I live in a state that educates 1 in 8 American children. I won't bore you with the details, but I got involved when our district completely failed. Since then, I've spent the last 7 years searching for truth, doing my homework, and analyzing what does and doesn't work in American educational reform. I'm deeply concerned about our kids' future, and despite plenty of education press, I'm convinced the public doesn't really understand the full story. Everyone already knows that America, and in my case, also as a state and a district, are losing badly, and that we are failing our children. Not only are our kids not keeping pace academically, they've got to face something we didn't, a modern job market that will be tougher than ever, requiring twice as many educated people than it did in the 1970s. Unfortunately, the situation is even worse than we are being led to believe. Our nation and our children are at greater risk than ever before. This really is a crisis. Education has got to become a priority in this country. You need to know exactly what's really going on and what isn't. This short video explains some things I am pretty sure you don't realize. Our country has spent hundreds of billions of dollars and a couple of decades on new initiatives to improve student outcomes. Yet the public is still very confused about what really needs to be done and whether or not we are making any progress. We're not getting the kind of meaningful information we need to understand where we really stand, what works, and what doesn't. There's a huge disconnect between what you're being told and what's really happening. It took me a while, but I finally made sense of the contradictory back and forth mix of news I kept seeing about our schools. Our state's educational leaders are telling the press and the public that our schools up and down the state are making significant and steady year after year progress. Our education officials are using our state's API scores as proof of this tremendous progress. They are telling the press and the public that twice as many kids are now performing at proficient levels and that their reforms are working. For instance, this particular district, its board, and its superintendent are telling the public that they transformed nearly the entire district into significantly higher performing schools. They are even using color-coded maps to show how failing, in this case red, low-performing schools, have been transformed into blue, high-performing schools, and how now only a few red, underperforming schools remain. This kind of factual data would lead most people to conclude that these districts had made undeniable progress. As a result, some districts have even produced beautiful videos to tell the public that it's working and that test scores are reaching all-time highs. This sounds like great news. Maybe our state's education crisis is finally behind us. While this data is correct, unfortunately, the conclusion is not. I hate to say it, but the truth is that the overall academic performance of our teens is dead flat. And when you include dropouts, statistically, over 75% of our kids are really failing. You will quickly learn about the real state of America's schools, and you'll learn about the big disconnect between test data, what state educational leaders are telling us, and our kids' real performance. In other words, in the end, you'll learn what to believe. The first thing to realize is that when educators show us rising API scores, is that they are not showing us the data at full scale, nor do they show the scores with corresponding letter grades or compare to schools that are making real improvements in student outcomes as shown here. I know it's basic human nature to put your best foot forward, and the data does seem to show that they are making some progress, just not as much as a few others. Unfortunately, as I'm about to show you, there's much more to the story, and that this apparent progress on the part of the district likely is not real. There are two very important things going on that I believe you need to understand. The first is what I call the American education ceiling, and the second I call API inflation, and it helps us better understand the shocking real state of our kids' schools. To better understand why I say this, we'll look at our historical performance on a couple of national tests. You'll see that today's 17-year-olds read at exactly the same level teens read at 40 years ago. We've made no progress at all with our teens. If you look closer, you'll find that this is the case even though today's 9-year-olds read a full year better than the kids did in 1971. In math, we see similar academic ceilings. Our 9-year-olds perform nearly 2 years better in math than they did 30 years ago, and our 13-year-old math scores are up about 1.5 years over what the kids did 40 years ago. But like in reading, these gains end with our older kids. Our 17-year-old math outcomes are no better today than they were 40 years ago. The trends show that white 17-year-old performance has been flat for as long as they have been administrating the test. Black and Hispanic 17-year-olds did see significant gains in the late 70s and 80s, but neither white, black, nor Hispanic 17-year-old outcomes have improved in 20 years. So nationally, historically, we have seen some progress on the NAEP, but only with our younger students. All progress ends with our teens. There's an invisible ceiling, and this has been going on for 40 years. So America's high school students are not doing better, despite 40 years of gains with younger children. So the question then becomes, are California's students doing better? Are the state's educators really helping our teens make progress when their peers across the nation are not? Unfortunately, the NAEP only breaks out state scores for younger children. They do not provide state data for 17 and 18-year-olds. So we have to use the data of younger students to judge whether our teens are the exception or not. The math and reading scores of California's 13-year-olds are about a year behind the national average and 2 years behind private schools. And, as you can see, the scores of our students tracks the nation's rate of improvement almost exactly. Therefore, since California's math and reading trends for 13-year-olds are not better than the national average, we can conclude that our 17-year-olds almost certainly see the same academic ceilings teens see at the national level. And that would mean that California schools are really doing no better at preparing our children for college than they ever were. But the NAEP is only one test. As a sanity check, let's see how California students are doing on other exams. Like the NAEP, a closer look at national SAT scores shows that American student performance is essentially flat in reading, math, and writing. And the only racial group to make any gains in SAT performance are Asian Americans. Andrew Coulson's Cato Institute analysis shows that California's SAT scores are flat or a little bit down, despite spending twice as much in inflation-adjusted dollars. This further backs up my claim that our schools are not changing the outcomes at the output of the K-12 system. The ACT test tells us essentially the same story. Finally, I contend that if our state were actually making undeniable progress, that California's national rankings on academic tests would be steadily moving up the ladder. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case, and our schools continue to score in the bottom 3 or 4 states. So while California state API proficiency soar, our kids' results on national tests remain flat. So if teen outcomes really are not improving, what does that say about our state's API exam and teen performance? It says that California's API gains do not represent any real improvement in subject mastery, that the state scores are inflated, and that teen scores need to be adjusted or handicapped to show a school's and/or a district's real academic performance level. Once I began to adjust school, district, and state API scores to reflect their students' real aptitude, I found these claims of better performance to be completely untrue, and that very few California schools and districts have improved one bit. And that district after district, school after school, are not only flatlining on student achievement, but that most are completely failing. It gets downright scary when we look at middle and high schools and dissect the scores of different demographics, even in our state's widely praised highest performing districts. So the truth is that the real high school performance of most of our urban districts, even those that are supposedly transforming their schools, is so bad that we have to add letter grades of G, H, and I to properly categorize their true level of education. I hate to say it, but the truth is these children will be effectively unhireable for anything other than manual labor and the prospect of competing with 20 other people for a single job. So contrary to what you're being told, most schools are not improving outcomes, nor are they closing achievement gaps. What people don't seem to realize is that America's public schools are doing a better job at getting our kids on base. We just are not bringing our teens home to score. The data shows that the American education problem is much less about early childhood education and more about helping our teens succeed. In a world where we see the symptoms on the news daily, the joblessness, wealth inequality, crime, and poverty, how would we solve these problems without addressing the root cause, education? Isn't it time we started shining the light of truth on these issues and got serious about really helping our children? The good news is there are some schools that are winning, that are getting real A's and B's and beating the odds. The children in these schools do better than affluent children in elite prep schools. They prepare nearly every child, regardless of circumstance, for college and a world of choice. For the most part, these organizations are charter schools. I found that they have very similar models, that they can reproduce these achievements, and they win even after applying the same adjustments. In fact, you can see that the performance of some of these schools is so good that it's only limited by the test itself. The improvement in performance difference between a typical school and a turnaround champion is night and day. And they are doing it with a student body full of low-income children, often from families new to the language. While this API adjustment process is not quantitatively perfect, it is good enough for us to see the forest from the trees. And qualitatively, it's good enough to help us distinguish revolutionary breakthrough from evolutionary change. If I am wrong, please tell me what exactly was it that fixed all of our schools? What specifically are our educators doing to improve achievement this much, everywhere across the state, at the same time? And how do we possibly explain away the fact that our performance has been flat on so many other indicators for over 40 years? So am I claiming that charter schools are better than traditional public schools? No, not at all. At least not automatically. But their winners absolutely are. And it's time we all focus on and learn from and do what these winners do. That or get out of the way. I've found that the winners and the status quo take two very different paths. I've found that the winners don't buy into the dogma, all of the things traditional public school leaders say they need. In fact, I'll go so far to say that the more you hear an educator ranting about these things, the less likely they will ever get your child to college. The winners, the real reform leaders, take an entirely different approach to beating the odds. This is not just a California problem. I'm sure this is an American problem, and that other states have reported API gains to the public without real NAEP gains. It's probably why over half the states have now received waivers from the Department of Education. And while now is not the time to go into a funding narrative, I've found, as I've hinted, that money without the right reforms is not the answer. The winners spend their money on entirely different things than we are told to do by the status quo. We all want failing kids from low-income communities to win, but the real truth is low-income districts are much better funded than you would think. It certainly surprised me. For instance, last year, Oakland budgeted $14,000 per student. The year before, it was $17,000. That's a lot of money. Roughly $5,000 more than cities like Benicia spend, and as much as elite private schools like De La Salle. Perhaps it's justified, but the truth is very different from most people's perception. 90% of K-12 funding comes from state taxes. About 10% comes from Washington. If I thought Californians could have an intelligent conversation about it, I would suggest we stop spending our money back east. It seems awfully inefficient when you consider that for every $100 we send to Washington, the state gets back $70 and only $43 makes it to the classroom. It gets even worse when you consider that when we borrow $100, even at a smart 6% fixed interest rate, it's going to cost our children around $215 to pay for their own education. That's roughly 5 times the amount had we directly funded their education today. Californians, we have an election coming up. Both measures are asking you for more money to fund education. If one of these measures passes, we won't approve another tax for years. So we better get this one right. It counts. I suggest you do your homework and be careful who you listen to. While I'm not suggesting we do so, it seems to me that too many of our state leaders have their priorities mixed up when you consider that one bullet train will cost as much as building 2,000 brand new schools. Will this really do more for us than fixing education? How can our politicians tell us we need more tax money for education and then go out and spend our money on this first, especially when money is so tight for everyone these days? If you live in California and want to learn more about the specific performance of our urban districts and the local schools in our neighborhoods, there is more info at neweraschools.com. Thank you for making your way through this presentation. We understand that truths like this aren't the kind of reality TV most Americans are used to anymore. If you found this analysis interesting and the information as important as we do, please forward it to all your friends. To learn what we've learned from winners, look us up at neweraschools.com. Check out our other video, Fixing Education Made Easy and Affordable, and download our vision brochure, The Formula for a Revolution. We believe they offer new, bolder solutions that tackle modern educational, economic, social, and familial issues head on. And finally, I'd like to thank and credit Alan Bonsteel, whose San Francisco Chronicle op-ed inspired this analysis. Thank you for making the time, and please consider joining us and others like us in our fight to revolutionize American K-12 education. Thanks again, and take care.